Hi, and welcome From Here to Data Maturity. Today, myself and Michael, as well as Kristen Monahan from PLOS, Matthew Wilmot from California Digital Library, and Amy Pawlowski from Ohiolink are going to talk a little bit about the journey of moving from a data, a non-data focused environment to one that focuses on data and uses data to aid in decision making. I'm the Chief Digital Officer at PLOS, and prior to that, had been a consultant for about 15 years working with organizations that did a lot of work with data and trying to figure out how to make it helpful and useful. So let's start by thinking about why we use data at all. And quite simply, we use data to answer questions. And no matter who you are and from what angle you might be looking at a situation at our industry, you'll have questions. For example, a librarian might want to understand what percentage of their journals are hybrid and at what rate, what percentage of their hybrid journals are open access and at what rate that's changing. A publisher might be curious about what % of their publications are governed by funder mandates. And you might also have people that are looking at the same type of question from a different angle. So a funder might be interested in understanding if researchers are complying with their mandates, and a researcher may want to understand how they can ensure their compliance. And all of these things can be addressed through the use of data. Now, a lot of organizations, it's been a lot of hype around data, and what we've found in many situations is that there are some critical ingredients for success. I think you'll hear a lot of stories about people that have attempted to start data programs and have had limited success or don't really see the value that they thought they would see. And fundamentally, that probably is because of one of these three things or some of the other best practices we'll get to in a minute. Leadership. You absolutely need a driver. Now, of course, you need an executive upper management type of leadership and commitment, especially when it comes to funding things that you might want to do if it involves, additional staff or tools. But you really need a driver. You need someone that's going to push forward that this is going to be what they eat, breathe, and sleep. You'll hear from Kristen Monahan after I'm done, who for PLOS was our driver, but this is a really important ingredient. You also need some literacy, understanding what you can and can't do with data, and how do you shape questions in order to come to meaningful answers. What's possible to do with data? What isn't possible to do with data? And the other thing is longevity, the idea that you make the commitment that this is a direction that you're going in, and as time changes, you're going to view data and your capabilities around data as an asset that you will continue to hone and to invest in. And that really, once you start on this path, you should be discovering more and more things that you can do with data, more and more questions that you can address, and the journey doesn't end. So let's talk a little bit about some key concepts or best practices. So Jeff Bezos has this quote, if you only do things where you know the answer in advance, you don't really get anywhere. Your company goes away. And the idea there is that I think there's twofold. One is you want to have that exploration. You want to try to answer questions that haven't been answered before. You want to explore in areas that haven't been explored before. But another underlying point of this quote is that you have to be open to answers that you don't expect. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. One of the things that we've found a lot historically, both at PLOS and I could say from my consulting career, is if everyone's not looking at the same data, prepared, cleaned, and managed in a consistent fashion, you wind up having different parts of your organization perceive different answers to the same question. So the idea of understanding where your data came from, how it's cleaned, how it's prepared, and how it's being used, and what kind of analyses are being performed on it is really very critical. One of my favorite comments that gets back to the bias issue is from Ronald Coase. If you torture data long enough, it will confess to anything. And the point is, it's really critical to start with an objective, with a research question, even with a hypothesis, if you will, and then assemble the right data to address that question and be open to the idea that it may not be the answer you were expecting. And of course, that needs to be balanced with subject matter expertise. So of course, you may get an answer that doesn't look right, doesn't look correct, and it's natural and understandable to then go back to query the data to make sure you understand what it's describing. But when all that checks out, if all that checks out, you have to be open to the idea that it might just be that what you thought is no longer true or wasn't true. And if that was one of my favorites, this is my absolute favorite. All models are wrong, but some are useful. You have to be really careful not to expect that the magic answer is going to pop out of a model based on your data. You have to understand that when we model and we try to use data to answer critical questions, we are trying to represent a very complex reality into, even if it's a complex model, it is still far less complex than the world around us. So what do? We come up with proxies, data that might represent or be related to something that we want to model but isn't exactly what we want to model. We do what we can with the data we have, and so what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to say what data we used, why we used it, what were our results, and what were some of our underlying assumptions. And the fact that our model isn't perfect and is, as George Box states here, wrong, it's still useful. It's still a better approximation than nothing. And I think you need to go into some of the projects that you might do with data, not saying, well, I need this perfect answer, but saying that I need to know more than I do today. I need to have more direction and more understanding. And then finally, one last point to bring up here is that this is a journey. And as you can see from this illustration, it isn't always a straight path. But the good news is that wherever you are, there is a way to go forward. Wherever state you're in right now, there's a way to hone your objectives and to pursue some type of a data program that will help you to meet those objectives. So just in summary, before we move on, have an objective, but be prepared to explore and be excited about exploration. Know your data, where it came from and what people have done to it and what it actually means. How is it defined? Balance everything you're doing with subject matter expertise, because there is a very big place for that here. Data doesn't just magically tell you things. You need people that understand their environment, but they and you need to balance that by trying to uncover your own biases and make sure they aren't influencing the interpretation of the results that you're seeing. Don't expect things to be perfect and keep going. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move on to Kristen Monahan. Kristen's going to talk a little bit more about infrastructure and some of the things required in order to build an infrastructure to support a data program. And then Matt and Amy are going to talk more about use cases and actually applying data to decision making.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Kristen. I'm a senior manager of data and insights at PLOS, and I've been at PLOS and thus in the scholarly communication industry since 2015. I currently manage a small team of data analysts and engineers, and we're working on building a scalable data ecosystem that will support PLOS's analytics needs for hopefully the next decade. Next slide, please. Many of you have been following along with PLOS's progress throughout the years, so this chart shouldn't be much of a surprise, but I just wanted to show you some key journal launches against the PLOS publication volume. Next slide, please. And then show you where and when we started our enterprise level data and analysis journey. Having joined in 2015, I'm not totally sure the kinds of use cases that were being made for data prior to that, but I do know that we built an in-house Drupal-based reporting system to layer on top of our manuscript processing system at the end of 2012. That's called Raptor, which is reporting and publishing tracking resources. It was a series of, it still exists, it's a series of SQL queries that spit out CSVs on high-level publishing measures. And then in 2015, we started the next chapter with SciSense. Next slide, please. Raptor. So we needed to prop up a system because PLOS One was too big for the manuscript system's native reporting. We needed to be able to report against milestones like submissions, acceptances, publications. Once we got all of that data into Raptor, PLOS realized it didn't have exactly the right staff to be able to manipulate that data, so they hired a business operations analyst in 2015, who was me. I came in and I broke Excel. I thought, okay, no worries. I can take this data, use everything I've done from my past, and it turns out Excel doesn't really like playing with a million rows of data. So we quickly pivoted and realized we needed a business intelligence system in order to support the data and analytics requests that we were getting. We also had problems with Raptor. Everyone was doing their own reports, so we didn't have a single source of truth. There were discussions on what is the definition of a submission, etc. Next slide, please. So we debated whether the project in 2015 would be a business or a technology project or a mix of both, and landed on it being a business one, given that at that time our technology and engineering team's resources were tapped. We walked away, the business walked away with one key piece of information from engineering and technology, which is don't build a data warehouse. It's too clunky. The resources we had in order to work on this BI project were me, a business operations analyst, and 2 database programmers. We reported up into the CFO. So we didn't have a data warehouse, so we knew we needed a full stack solution, a product that could sort of hold all of the data modeling, as well as do ETL functions, extract, transform, and load. In theory, we also knew that we needed a data governance program and to be able to support data literacy through the organization. Next slide, please. So about 12 months into the project, we've deployed SciSense. Very quickly realized that no data warehouse was not the right solution. We just outgrew it as quickly as we deployed it. We hadn't accounted for how quickly our staff was going to pick up the analytics, which is amazing. They asked significantly more questions, complex questions of the data we had, and totally reasonable questions of data that we couldn't plug into the system because of the way it was built. We didn't have the leadership, the appropriate leadership in place to support a formal data governance initiative. And the 3 of us, me and the 2 database programmers, we definitely did the best that we could, but we made a mess of the data models and just continued to make that mess. We started with questions about submissions and publications, and those grew into questions about who did what with which manuscript, how quickly, and how does that information correlate with any activities down the line. We just didn't know all of the business questions before we started modeling and didn't prepare ourselves to be able to answer unknown questions. Next slide, please. So thankfully, we got a do-over, which I know doesn't happen all the time. And next slide, please. We started this time with what the business really wanted to know, like really wanted to know. How many, how quickly, from whom, from where, about what, as related to other PLOS activities, as related to competitors, as related to the world around us, and my favorite part, can we make the world a better place by knowing all of these things? Next slide, please. We inventoried what we had. We have a CRM system, a manuscript system, an accounting system, a marketing communication system, web data, market data. We took this inventory knowing that PLOS's strategy is not solely dependent on the processing of research papers. Could you go back one, please? Thank you. So who do we have? We had folks, we had analysts, we have engineers. They weren't all on the same team. And importantly, we had analytical leaning people throughout the entire organization. But we were missing an executive to truly champion this initiative. Next slide, please. So with Anne on board, we began to strategize. We knew that we had access to much of the data we needed in order to derive the valuable insights to help business with strategic decision making. We definitely needed operations reports. Sisense proved that value, but we also determined that we needed a quote unquote people database. How can we best communicate with our communities when we're not totally sure how to define those communities? And with the amount of data at our fingertips, we decided we needed to build an ecosystem that can support machine learning, NLP, and advanced analytics. And lastly, as learned through the prior two reporting initiatives, we needed to build a scalable infrastructure. Next slide, please. So plan in hand, and with the right leadership, we're now in the throes of reconstructing our data ecosystem from a single BI tool that acted as a data warehouse and an ETL tool, and which could only handle two sources. We got approved a budget that was 5 times that of the original budget in 2015, as well as the time to dig into which kind of systems are most appropriate for long-term access and use of our data. Ultimately, we are creating the robust system for the robust discovery of information nestled within the data, the kinds of work that Matt and Amy are going to cover next. Thank you.
Thanks, Kristen. Hi, I'm Matt Wilmot. I am the Open Access Collection Strategist at the California Digital Library. And I'm going to talk about our pathway to data maturity, particularly with respect to our transformative agreements. I like to think that we're doing some fairly exciting things around these types of agreements and making good progress on transitioning our authors' publication from subscription-based publication to open access. And a lot of that has been very data-driven. So I've given a few talks before about the nuts and bolts of our analyses, and I'm excited to take this different focus, not just what are the results that we're seeing, but what's the journey we've taken to get there, because that's really important to examine as we move through these things. So it helps to start with a little bit of history. It's important to note that a lot of growing at the University of California for some time now. The library system in particular has been relying on data-driven decision-making relating to traditional library collections for quite a few years. A prime example is the CDL value metric that was developed several years ago, which really works to sort of normalize the value of subscriptions to the University of California across publishers, across subjects, various aspects, in a way that makes it critical to our collections decisions because we can see the value that we're getting for our investments. Even our researchers have been involved in data-driven decision-making around publishing. A researcher at the University of California, Santa Barbara, Ted Bergstrom, has been working for years on resources like journalprices.com and Eigenfactor. So there's a lot of history there within the university. There's also a lot of history of open access advocacy within the university system. Just a couple examples to note. We in UC and in the California Digital to spearhead the U.S. participation in the Scope 3 consortium starting in 2008. And our Faculty Academic Senate passed an open access policy in 2013 that provided for all faculty research outputs to be made openly available through our institutional repository. And so both of these general pathways culminated in the Pay It Forward project, which started in January 2015. This was a grant-funded, large-scale, data-driven assessment of the APC business model, and particularly its sustainability and feasibility within large North American research institutions. This was driven because library leadership wanted some guidance on how to leverage our limited library resources to drive change within the organization, and particularly change that towards open access that our stakeholders had been encouraging us to work towards. For this project, the folks administering the project pulled together a team of experts. So we had economists, we had engaged academic researchers who were interested in these areas, we had research librarians, and this is also when I joined California Digital Library. I was previously a librarian, and I also had an academic background in math and statistics, and so I joined as the data analyst on this project to help us start working with the theory that was being built through here. And I really think that this project was the starting point of this most recent effort to move towards open access agreements and transformative agreements. We did a lot of deep work on theory based on the input from these experts that were brought in for the project, thinking about what is feasible and sustainable in North American research institutions. And we did also a lot of deep work on data modeling, including learning how to gather and work with publication data, which is not something that we had really done a lot of previously within the libraries. And so fast forward to today, and we've had what I like to think are fairly significant successes recently, starting with our agreement with Cambridge University Press in April of 2019, all the way up to our agreement with Springer Nature, which was announced just a couple months ago. And while each one of these is really unique to the publisher's circumstances, what they have in common is the data-driven way that we approached each one, crafting them based on the modeling that we've been able to do to move in this direction. So how did we get there from Pay It Forward to these successes that we're looking at? It really started with some deliberate work within the library to build our functional capacity for this type of work. It's probably no surprise that much of this means bringing together the right people. And that began with all of these experts in their fields that we tapped in the Pay It Forward study. They brought a lot of the right mindset to these issues to help us in the library focus on the different problems that we needed to tackle. Additionally, I personally built a lot of expertise through the Pay It Forward study, and CDL made the deliberate choice to retain that expertise and leverage it rather than keeping the Pay It Forward study as its own self-contained object. And I think that represents a strategic choice to dedicate the organization towards this ongoing pathway towards data maturity. In general, I would say because we're still sort of in the formative years of this work, the being a right person for this type of work means as much having a good sense of creative and analytical problem solving as it does refined expertise in publishing data or in libraries. We also needed to develop our overall internal knowledge. A lot of that was done during the Pay It Forward project, but as Anne was mentioning, the analysis is really never complete. There's always more to learn. So to do that, we spent a lot of time thinking very critically about the environment that we're in, what data is needed to understand and shape it, and then also doing some research into what data is actually available and how to get and use that data. Then the next step of work is just to determine how to bridge the gap between those, between what we need and what we're able to get. And that's how we can build this impactful analysis that can help drive our strategy. And another important aspect of this is learning how to assess and interpret risk, because particularly in these areas of transformative agreements, there are more variables now and there's less certainty, and we need to understand how to interpret that and bring that into our thinking. And then finally, we need to work to create the right tools and strategies to help us make use of this data and this analysis. That generally means developing tools that take multiple inputs and build robust but flexible models that can give us cohesive insights. It's also important to learn what's not relevant or what we don't need to analyze. It's always unfortunate when some work goes unused, but a critical outcome is knowing what is not impactful as well as knowing what is impactful. And it's important to mention that much of this is iterative. So we learn what's impactful and resonant, and then we can iterate with our stakeholders to continue building things that are more impactful. Just a quick example of impactful outputs is some analysis that we did of spending on publishing fees outside of otherwise traditionally subscription agreements. The work that we did here really helped us to identify and segment publishers with sort of moderate open access offerings in comparison with their subscription offerings, like Elsevier, and identify other publishers which have large open access offerings that potentially represent larger investments by our authors than we were aware of, and in particular Springer Nature and AAAS. And so AAAS in particular has one large open access investment in this journal through publishing fees increases our overall University of California investment with AAAS by 92% when compared with just what we knew about from our subscription spend. Overall, across the university, we were able to project that compared to our $40 million or so in subscription spend, our authors are spending another $10 million in open access publishing fees. And that was really an impactful and insightful result that we were not expecting. It's important to note that these types of analyses can have multiple audiences too, right? The bottom line numbers here are important for discussing our overall program with faculty and other stakeholders, whereas the publisher-specific information is really good for library strategists who are trying to develop a plan for working with individual publishers. This journey also required some overall development within the organization to help the library become a data-driven organization. And that starts with having the right administration. It requires administrators that are open-minded and are willing to engage in these types of ideas. And we need them to have some basic data literacy or to develop some basic data literacy so that they can use this data to help inform their policy and their opinions. Right, so the next piece of building this organizational trust and support is really building on incremental success to get to a point where we can become a data-driven organization. And it's really important not to underestimate or rush this part of the journey. We can't just drop an analysis like I just showed in front of a group of stakeholders and assume that it will be impactful. You have to build up to that level of data literacy and trust in the work that's being done. That incremental success can start with things as simple as providing one-off data points in support of specific purposes that stakeholders might have to help them build into their conversations. That can really build that trust, and it can also build a sense of needing more data to fuel further conversations. We can then move on to things like standalone analyses, right, that can help our stakeholders to let data start to shape their opinions even outside of that immediate need for an upcoming conversation. And that helps to move them into the right mindset of working towards a culture of being data-driven. And we can also iterate on that by showing bigger successes through specific data-driven strategies. And I would say that our earlier agreements from what I showed on a previous slide, it would be an example where we built those through very data-driven strategies, and we're able to observe them and assess their success and figure out how to build off of that. And then eventually, this data-driven thinking becomes embedded in everything that we do. Right now, for us, when we're approaching a negotiation with the publisher, reconciliation of the publication data is our first critical step to make sure that we're working from the same bed of data on which we can build everything else we do. In talking with these publishers, we even often use our data and modeling to craft our own proposal about an agreement. And I know this is rare for libraries, but we find that our ability to do that and taking the initiative to do that really makes for a better conversation and helps us drive the change that our stakeholders are looking for us to do. And we're even starting to develop data-focused approaches to our overall strategy and how we're staging conversations with publishers. And so while this isn't fully vetted yet with our full stakeholders, one example of how we're doing that is by building a strategy to use both quantitative and qualitative data to help us plan and align our conversations with our strategies so that we can stage our conversations and negotiations with publishers in a way that's appropriate. And that's important to us because we have several priorities in who we're talking with, including diversity of publisher types, sizes, subject areas, business models, and being able to make sure that we're proceeding strategically is critically important to us. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention a couple other developments that happened during this time as we were moving towards data maturity, which are maybe less data focused, but are still reliant on data. A critical one is coalition building. We really needed to work to build organizational support for our efforts around transformative agreements. And that meant engaging the right people, asking for appropriate guidance from faculty members and other administrators. And our data has helped in all of those conversations, particularly in conversations with our researchers, because they are very data focused in their own jobs and their everyday life. And so seeing that we are able to be data focused as well gives them a lot of confidence in what we're doing, and helps get them engaged in the process. And we've also done a lot of work to develop our strategy and our ideology. We're not working towards exactly the same theory that we built in the Pay It Forward project. And as Anne mentioned, a lot of that means bringing in subject expertise to supplement the data analysis that we've done. So talking with campus librarians and other stakeholders to develop these strategies. And data fuels all of these conversations, particularly through continuous assessment of the work that we're doing. We can use that assessment data to iterate and improve these agreements moving forward. And so what's next for us in CDL now that we're at this point that we're having these successes? First, we're working on expanding our capacity even further to conduct these analyses. We're doing that by hiring a new data analyst into our team in CDL, among a couple of other folks that are helping to expand our capacity to work on these. This has been critically important because we found that our work in this area has created more and more work for us, and we're getting to a point that we're starting to reach the limits of what we were able to handle. So now we're needing to add to our capacity to be able to undertake these types of analyses. We're working on widening our engagement in partnerships with other institutions, particularly in helping those institutions to become more data-driven themselves. These efforts help us to learn how to tackle more bigger issues. They also help to advance these efforts towards open access on a larger scale than we can do just within the UC system. We're working towards better collaborations with other data-focused institutions. We really feel like this is a way to expand our capacity as well, and that we can improve our own abilities by sharing best practices and learning from others' experiences. And we can do more by working in collaboration with those institutions on joint projects and other efforts that we might be able to undertake. We're trying to dive into some of the bigger untapped questions that we've identified, particularly around thinking about the organization's full investment in publishing and how we can build agreements around that. And also how we can assess author behavior under new changing incentives, both as the world is changing and as we're offering these new agreements to authors. That's critically important because we need to learn from what our authors are telling us through their behavior to make these agreements better as we move forward. And then, of course, as always, we're trying to use this information to build more and to build more improved open access agreements. So with that, I will turn it over to Amy to talk about what's happening in Ohio.
Thank you, Matt. I have a great tie-in as I work through the presentation between Ohiolink and its data efforts and Matt's Pay It Forward project, and I'll make sure to mention that as I go through my slides today. Thank you. My name is Amy Pulowski. I'm the Interim Executive Director at Ohiolink, which I've been since February. Prior to that, I was the Deputy Director at Ohiolink for about 7 years, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about our organization and our data maturity journey. So really quickly, if you are not familiar with Ohiolink, we have 116 member libraries. It's really all the public universities, the two-year colleges and technical schools in Ohio, plus almost all of the nonprofit private institutions. And with that, we have a wide range of types of institutions. So for example, we have 5 ARLs. Interestingly, we have the Cleveland Clinic as a member, and then the State Library of Ohio. We also have some theological unions, colleges of art and music, and then of course law and medical libraries. So really quickly, our services, we tend to put them in 3 kind of service buckets, although the last one you could probably label as stuff. But we do shared print collections. So all of our members are on a shared catalog and share print with each other. And there's over 45 million items in that catalog. We're at about 350,000 items delivered across the membership each year. We also, of course, this is a big chunk of our work, is our shared e-resources. So we have an annual content purchase of about $45 million in e-journals and e-books and databases. All sorts of a number of databases and e-books, and then journal collections. And then under the technology services or the stuff, we do have our own electronic journal platform. So we are still locally loading the journals that we are purchasing and serving them up on our own platform that we call the EJC. We also do the same with our ebook collection. So we have the EBC, the Electronic Book Center. And then, of course, we help our members manage their database platforms. We also have an open access with electronic theses and dissertation platform that we host at Ohiolink and run for our participating members. We have the central catalog. So as I mentioned, we do shared print. So the central catalog is what allows us to share print amongst each other. There's also a discovery layer that we have for some members, and then we manage the link resolver. We also do centralized cataloging, so metadata services. So we have 2 catalogers in-house that will make more robust records of Ohiolink content purchased and that deliver that to members to use for their own local catalog. We have a very active, affordable learning program in which we are engaged in several inclusive access contracts for our members to reduce costs on that content, as well as OER efforts across the state. And then lastly, we actually support an e-tutoring collaborative across the state. It's not all Ohiolink members, but those members that are interested in participating. So as you can see, there's a lot of different projects that we use data to know about. So where are we? So it's 2020, and with Ohiolink, I can put how we collect and analyze our data into more or less 2 categories. So the first is for business decisions. So with resource evaluation and assist with contract negotiations, so not much different than what Matt is working on at CDL. So we will take a look at how that content is performing, how much we paid for it, and deciding if there's really a value there. So it's kind of a value assessment of those content packages. We do use data on deeper evaluations of new initiatives and potential initiatives. So an example of that would actually be the inclusive access contracts that we recently cut. When we were getting ready to do those contracts, we were actually asking member institutions and even textbook publishers for data about adoption on campus. So either print adoption or ebook adoption to try to decide, what a low-hanging fruit, so to say. So, what publishers could we go after for inclusive access contracts that would give us our biggest bang for the buck? So where did we see a lot of adoption, and who could we approach for a potential partnership? We also use it to evaluate our print sharing program. I have some examples of how we evaluate that with our members, just monitoring how print sharing is working across the organization. And then we also use data to derive cost allocations for our members when we do cut new deals for content. The second bucket is to tell our story and inform our stakeholders. And this is something that came about after, and I'll talk about this, that came about kind of after we got our feet under ourselves with data analysis for business decisions. So it's important to us. We are a government agency, and we report up to the Ohio Department of Higher Education. So it's important for us to put good data behind our value statements whenever we're talking to, who is funding us and how we're getting that funding. But it's also important for us to outline our value to our members and help them understand how the consortium works together. So I'll go over a few examples of how we present that data to our members towards the end of my presentation. So our data collection and evaluation initiative was not passed down to me from previous administration. Gwen Evans, who was the executive director when I started, and I built this program when we started at Ohiolink. So let me explain where we were and how we got to where we are. So in 2013, which is when I started at Ohiolink, this is what we were left with, what Gwen and I were left with. We had some annual reports that contained some data points and analysis and some files around how past administration had gotten to those numbers, but there was no documentation outlining how that data was used, how the data was gathered, and how it was analyzed. So no formal process to collect and store and use data for the evaluation. Also talking about we weren't really looking closely at entitlements. As I mentioned, we have the Electronic Journal Center, and entitlements are very important because we're actually purchasing that content and locally loading it. So there was really nothing in place to ensure that what was getting delivered to us for the EJC from the publishers was what we should be getting. So how did we get there? So our path, working off of Anne's 3 points, it starts with leadership. So as I mentioned, in 2013, Ohiolink was going through a bit of an organizational rebuild. I was hired on as the Deputy Director of Operations and Negotiations in November 2013, and quickly realized that all of the things I just mentioned, that we really weren't doing that great of a job tracking our data, watching our data, and doing any sort of analysis to make smart business decisions. So I had, as the Deputy Director, requested a data analyst position to the Executive Director, Gwen Evans. And Gwen, of course, approved that, and we hired the position in July 2014. Now, when I say I just went to Gwen, I didn't knock on her door and say, hey, I think we need a data analyst position, and she didn't say, okay. To go ahead and convince her that this was a good idea, I did prepare a justification document for the position. So all of the things that we needed to take a look at, we talk about content leakage, but again, it's just making sure that we were getting what we're supposed to have and ensuring that our users had access to it was really important. So Gwen quickly recognized that there was a need and fully supported our efforts. So when we hired the position, which we initially call a collections analyst, we were focusing on the analysis of collections. So again, making sure that we were getting what we were supposed to be getting, what our title lists were, and then again, looking at the value of those. Are we paying too much? Are we using all the content in our collection packages? And then from there, since we were so successful with those efforts, it kind of grew into our marketing efforts, or telling our stories to our stakeholders. So our data needs and how we presented that data grew organically out of taking a look at our collections. So literacy. So this is kind of our, I guess our growing pains. Define analysis goals for regular content evaluation. So this started with me really asking Joanna questions about the value and the use of our content packages. So again, not very different than what California Digital Library is doing. And this really helped us make good purchasing decisions and making sure that we were getting the value out of what we were providing for our members. It was important at this point to set the table early and making sure that we were doing things consistently. So data points and analyses were done the same way with every vendor and documented. So I really can't talk enough about the importance of making sure that you're documenting how you're running an analysis, especially if it's something that you're going to be doing, on some sort of regular cadence. And then documenting that. So the next time you go run that evaluation, you're positive that you use the same data in the same way, and then you can start comparing year-over-year differences. And then we would do supplemental analysis as needed, but definitely still documented, right? So we were kind of setting the table with what we were doing on a regular basis, and then what we call ad hoc. So an important process to all of this, as Joanna and I were going through and working through these analysis for our content collections, we were doing this with our, it's called CERM, but it's our content committee, and it's really the group for Ohiolink that decides what we're purchasing, what we're renewing as far as content is concerned. And the great thing about this group is the majority of them are ADs. So they're higher ups at their institution. They understand data. They understand the importance of looking at data, especially when trying to make financial decisions. So when we're meeting with that group and having these discussions, and you have the executive director in the room, it's pretty easy to get to how it's important. And how it could definitely aid the organization moving forward. So as I mentioned, that value analysis grew organically from findings of content evaluations. So longevity. So for business decisions, the consistency with evaluations that have a cadence. So I mentioned that it's really important to keep that all documented. That saves us a lot of time and energy. Right now we only have 2 staff members doing data analysis, and there's plenty of work to go around. For print sharing metrics measured with the same process year over year, again, those are all set. We have someone that runs that catalog and does that evaluation with Joanna. And again, that is all documented so we can be consistent with our year over year analysis and look for trends. And then we also use data for new initiatives, as I mentioned, data gathering and analysis, as I talked about with our Inclusive Access program. That's a great example. But more recently, taking a look at OER uptake across the state of Ohio. It's important to mention and to think about data along the whole entire path. So with Ohiolink, whenever we are about to embark on a new initiative or a new program, the lead staff member does a project plan. And in that project plan, data gathering and analysis are fully integrated into that plan. So we decide early on what we want to know for the program. So setting up our measures of success. And then we take a look at what data is available to us to help us decide what benchmarks we're setting and how we are defining success. For telling our story and informing our stakeholders, we have moved into what we call our planning document, and this document is our marketing metrics and timeline document, and this is the brainchild of Joanna Voss, and this really goes again to being efficient, right? This is to make sure that we're doing something once, we're doing it right the first time, and then we're being consistent about how we're doing it. And that we're not loading a bunch of work on the data team all at once. So our marketing metrics and timeline outlines what metrics we need to know when, as well as evaluations for our content that's on there. But for example, that planning timeline has the metrics we use to get to that piece of information, what the analysis cadence is. So do we do it every 6 months? Do we do it every year? And then the metrics gathering owner. So sometimes Joanna is the gathering owner. Sometimes Sita, who runs our catalog, is pulling together the print pieces. And then the source in which the data point is used. So for example, are we putting this in our annual report? Are we putting this in a special publication to some constituents? Really kind of outlining and planning out how our data is used and where. So I want to talk a little bit about execution with this telling our story and stakeholders. So I have some examples for how we're using this. And as I've mentioned, data gathering and analysis is not enough. I think all of our speakers today have talked about this. You have to appropriately pinpoint and present the most compelling points to each stakeholder, and definitely use data visualizations, but how you use them may vary depending on your audience. So my first example is a chart that we show our resource selection committee. So we have meetings every month, as I mentioned. And this chart, it's not very visual. I don't need to give this group a pie chart. They want to see trends and they want to see amounts. These are obviously not the official cost amounts and the usage and cost per use. I put in some dummy numbers there just to explain that we will look at year over year. So this again goes back to the importance of being consistent with how you're putting your data together. when we talk about telling our stories to stakeholders, this is a few screenshots from a value of Ohiolink Flyer that we very much geared towards government officials, so representatives, to hand out to our members as they're meeting with their local representatives to talk about Ohiolink and make sure that it stays forefront in our legislature's mind. So, you know, really great example, one of our talking points is that someone interacts with an Ohiolink piece of content every 1.2 seconds. And then lastly, telling our story to our members. So these are some screenshots from our Summit magazine, in which we were trying to tell our members the story of how our users are using our content. So you can see we have a graphic with, they're really engaging with e-resources and ebooks, and then our databases, and then, you know, print is not quite as broadly used as it used to be. So these are just some quick examples as to how using data visualizations for the right audience at the right time is just as important as how you're gathering the data and doing your analysis. Thank you.
So thank you all very much. That was really very helpful. And I thought it was really interesting to see that there was some commonality too in even how capabilities were built. The idea of starting with what you have, answering more basic business questions, presenting that information in a way that builds an understanding and that builds a little demand too, you know, and then kind of reiterating, expanding data sources, expanding infrastructure, expanding staff as needed. So what I thought we could do is just go through a couple of questions. And where I wanted to start was, all three of you are different, or us, I guess I'm included here too. We're organizations of different sizes, different capabilities, different financial assets that we have access to. What would be your recommendation to maybe for, you know, Matt and Amy, a small library, maybe Kristen for a small publisher, a society with 1 journal or 2 journals? What kind of data should they be thinking about, and what kind of decisions can it help them make? How do they get started? And somebody chime in here who would like to get started on the question.
I can start because we have a fair amount of small libraries within Ohiolink. You know, I have conversations with them on a regular basis talking about, you know, the analysis that we do for membership content, but also how can you take how we're doing data analysis for us and use that for local collections or local decisions. So the easy answer is we are not using a big giant platform. Everything that I talked about that we're doing today, Joanna is honestly using Excel. She breaks it all the time, Kristen. But, you know, so we may roll things over to OpenRefine. That's something that's free and easy to use. And then we're using Tableau, which is very inexpensive to go ahead and do visualizations. And you can even do some of those visualizations right out of Excel directly. You know, bars and charts and graphs are easily doable within Excel. So for smaller institutions, I don't want them to feel that this is unsurmountable, right? You have the tools to go ahead and do some sort of basic analyses and not really break the bank.
Thanks.
Agreed. Excel will be part of my life forever. With regard to like the kind of data that a small publisher might need, I think we needed to switch our thinking at PLOS to away from the manuscript and thinking about the service that we provide. We're a service organization. Without the people involved, whether those are authors, reviewers, editors, or even staff members, we have no business. There's no business at PLOS. So what kind of data do you need in order to figure out where the hiccups are in sort of your editorial operations processes is one set of data. And then another large set of data is all of people. How do you describe people, demographic, psychographic, in relation to manuscripts, in relation to the world outside of you? One's a little bit easier to capture than the other. Manuscript data to me is a little bit easier to capture than people data. So start smaller, work with milestones, chunk those, and then split those milestones into smaller bits, and just keep it narrower and narrower.
Yeah, I would say I don't have a lot to add beyond what Amy and Kristen have said. The couple points that come to my mind that are maybe a little different are, I would say, in terms of what data you're trying, what data would be good to start looking at. I think that really depends on the stakeholders in your organization that are looking to move towards a data-driven approach, right? I mean, looking back at our activities in CDL, the Pay It Forward project, which was, I really see as sort of the cornerstone of a lot of what we've done since, was in response to specific stakeholder needs to think about a particular problem, right? How do we leverage our limited resources to create change? And so what we were able to do at that time is focus on data gathering around that particular problem. But that same problem is not the same one that a small library might be looking to solve. It might be something else that a vocal faculty member is asking about, or an administrator needs to know, right? These are all great opportunities to start thinking about how to become more data driven in response to these questions that come up. And in terms of how to get started, in addition to all of the low-cost options that Amy mentions, I would say another great strategy is to work on collaboration across institutions, both in the sense of finding other institutions that are in a similar boat that want to do similar things that you could benefit from working together. And also from the perspective of there's a lot out there that's already been done that you can try to replicate and learn from and build off of. And I think those, all of that creates a great starting point for these organizations that might just be getting started and don't have a lot of resources, right? Is going and learning what's out there and trying to reuse that. I mean, I still do that in my own analysis, is watch what others are doing, watch the data visualizations that Amy's putting up that are impactful for Ohiolink, and think, oh, I'm going to take a couple of those to use for our own faculty, right? That's always a part of this process.
Right, about that. What is it? The highest form of flattery, right, Amy? So I'm actually going to ask you a question that is not a question we discussed before, but it occurred to me as we were talking. So on the one hand, we're saying, how do you get started? But now let's say you actually are started and you're getting requests and you're getting more requests and you're getting more requests. How do we manage that flow? Like, for example, I know that one of the tactics that we've used a lot, not only just in PLOS, but even on the consulting business I was in before, was having a very laser focus on what are you going to do with this? Like, deciding what data to collect. Well, how are you going to use it? And things of that nature. But how do you manage demand when now it starts to overwhelm?
We align our work first to the enterprise level strategy. So if your organization has enterprise level strategy, it's much easier to prioritize against what the rest of the organization is working on. But I also work with my teammates on trying to figure out the value, which it could be a little political depending on your organization, but the value of the request. Could it be used in other departments? And trying to figure out the next question that your internal client doesn't actually know that they're going to ask. So trying to create more value from that original question than what might initially appear to be there.
Yeah, I would say it's important to be very strategic about this, because that can become a challenge very quickly, especially as you show the value in the insights you're able to provide. Everybody wants more of those insights, right? I would say we do our best to be strategic about how to accomplish multiple ends with one particular analysis, right? So looking across the organization, like Kristen was saying, anticipating what questions might come up and thinking about how to make our analyses more extensible to beyond just what we're looking at, I think really helps to manage that demand. I think it's also critical to think about sort of building some strategic planning about how to maintain the steady state and how much more effort is required to do this, right? I think Amy had a great example of this with the planning timeline of the different metrics that are collected, who does it, when and how often it happens, right? Being very deliberate about that is key. And I think that just comes with experience and needing to build up this infrastructure over time of how to do that, because it can get out of hand quickly if you're just handling one-off requests and then they start coming in faster and faster.
So all great points. A few things I can add to that. I jotted down, be respectful with your questioning. It's just this morning. So I had a resource committee just this morning, and we were going over an analysis of a deal, and someone asked a question about, it was really kind of around the value of a back file, of a particular range of back file. And although an interesting question, that would be interesting to know, the question back to that person was, well, what is that really going to tell us? And would that really change how we would make a decision? And the answer was no, right? So with us, it's, there's personalities here, and making sure that, when we are talking through any sort of analysis or what we might want to know, that we're being respectful with what is being asked, but also making sure that as kind of Matt pointed out, that there's a value to that evaluation. The second piece for that, and this is interesting for me to talk about because I am now the executive director, but is that as a leader, being very aware of the time and energy that your data people need for a particular project. And Kristen, I was the deputy director, so this was also falling under me. And Gwen is a great thinker, and she was, constantly asking questions. And really great questions. So they weren't really questions that I can say, well, what are we going to get out of that? They were all very good questions. So it was Gwen and I used to call it, she would say, manage me up, right? So we would sit down and we would talk about what she's asking and when did we, the value of the answer to that, when would that be most impactful? And just kind of try to lay out a timeline for when you're working on a project.
One more thing as you were talking, Amy, and as all of you were talking, I was thinking about is there are great tools out there, and when you have consistent data and you know what it is and how it was collected and you can define it, you have some kind of catalog around it, you can also start to democratize some of these analyses. So Tableau, as you mentioned, can actually do some really neat visualizations, and you or Joanna don't have to do them necessarily. And not only that, when you start to get your constituency, whether it's the business that you're working with or it's your stakeholders like different libraries that you might be working with or other partnerships, when you get them embedded in data and having them manipulated through those through those visualizations, they learn more about the data too. They ask better questions because they understand what it took for them to do it in this nice little box that you provided for them. So that's one thing that I would say a plus, is that there are a whole lot of people now outside of Kristen's centralized team that can do a little bit of self-service when it comes to counting things, trending things, some of these more, I don't want to say basic, they're important, but more ubiquitous kinds of analyses. So 2 more questions. First one, what do you think is next? What do you think are the kinds of questions or requests that your constituencies are going to ask you to address? And how comfortable do you feel addressing them, and what else do you need?
I would say from my perspective, and I hinted at this a little bit on one of my slides, is I think we've been very internally focused in our analysis historically, and the paid forward analysis, we tried to be as widely focused as possible. We had partners from outside of the University of California, but a lot of our research focuses on University of California output and how do we make that into a transition to open access for this particular purpose, right? And I think this will be my example, but I think it will extend to other areas too, is that the next step is to be more global. Think about how the analysis we're doing can improve our processes and those everywhere else, right? Because all of our stakeholders are interested in this. In this example of open access agreements, right? Our stakeholders are keenly interested in how what we're doing could impact researchers in the developing world, could impact researchers that are not affiliated with the university. All of these more global questions that are beyond just the internal analysis that we're doing. And I think that will be a really big question moving forward. And how we tackle that, I think, is by extending our collaborations with others that are also in a similar stage and starting to think about these, right? Because by building in those diverse opinions from various areas that are focusing on these problems, we can make more robust solutions that can address these sort of global questions.
I'm on mute.
For libraries, I think, gosh, and as soon as you started talking, I was like, oh, the pandemic, and you know, the value of what you're getting, and everyone's having budget challenges and budget issues, and you know, how do you surmount that, and what does that mean for us and our analysis, right? Because we already are doing what we need to do to evaluate our resources as far as value and cost is concerned. But I do think for us, with the pandemic and with budgets being what they are, and our affordable learning initiatives, we're going to be stepping into that OER space and trying to evaluate OER and its impact on higher education in a much broader sense than just, hey, we saved students, you know, a couple $100 because we did this, right? So it's talking about adoption on your campus and what is going on worldwide. I think Lyrasis just released an analysis of, you know, both OA initiatives and then OER initiatives, and I really do think that because of the pandemic, we're really just going to be taking a look at different types of content in different ways.
I am scared of what's going to be asked next that I'm not aware of, but I anticipate predictive modeling should be part of our offering 2021 forward, although it'd be pretty rudimentary. And then something I'm interested in that doesn't really seem to appeal to anybody else, but I have an audience now, is like network models and business planning. So one of the challenges that I have had is like, for PLOS One, what kinds of papers are we publishing? Well, a paper about biochem isn't only about biochem. And if biochem is sort of a product category and we're doing predictive modeling based on sections of the scientific sphere, that doesn't lend itself to rows and columns in traditional financial planning. That is clustering. So how does that kind of analytics play into business and financial planning? So that's one of my things I want to work on.
That's a really good one, Kristen. Yeah.
Well, and you know, actually, so you set us up for the last question really, really well, because we were thinking about this before. When you think about predictive modeling in general, when you look at what's going on now, basically what you're saying is, let's take the past and trends in the past, and maybe some other factors that might be correlated or whatnot, and think about what's going to happen in the future. What are potential outcomes? Will this trend continue? Will it not continue? But what happens when your past data is no indication of what could happen in the future, like COVID-19 as an example? So now, what I'd like to talk a little bit about, just briefly, and then we'll wrap up, is just how the situation we're in impacts how we approach modeling. And the one thing I'll start with is by saying, I know that we've been looking a lot more towards scenario planning and ranges of possibilities. So we might be able to look at an analysis and say, well, X may have been correlated with Y in the past, and now if X changes, what do we think might happen to Y? But you know, and what are the ranges in which this could impact whatever the particular thing we're analyzing is? But also, what are the triggers? So it might be that we have, you know, let's call it scenario 1, scenario 2, scenario 3, and maybe they're, you know, best, worst, worst, you know, and then what could cause us to move into that vector, these different vectors, and what should we be watching for? But I'm curious, what do you all think about how do you model when the path is less informative from a predictive perspective?
And
Okay,
I just
sorry,
had,
go ahead.
oh, okay. I just had a conversation with, so Theta is our catalog manager, and so by default, she's managing our courier services, which is how our print moved around the state. So you heard me say we move about 350,000 pieces across the state. Well, that was old. And that number's been going. So we've done some modeling around what's our breaking point. You know, we're paying X amount of dollars for the courier service. What's our breaking point for when we just ask libraries to throw items in a box and send it UPS because that's less expensive than paying for a courier, right? So we had kind of, Theta, we modeled it out. We were kind of ready, and we knew when we were going to be close. And then the pandemic happened, and we had to shut down lending. So for the first time in Ohiolink's history, we had to stop lending because no one was in the buildings to accept courier deliveries. People weren't borrowing. And we just this week started working courier back up and lending again. So this year, it's gone. Like what we predicted is done. It's dust. So we were just talking about what do we do now, right? So we know it accelerated the trend, but how much and to what extent, and how do we plan for that now? You know, I think we're going to be looking very closely at these things over the next few months. You know, we take a look at what's going to pick up, but then you have to weigh that with, we're still in a pandemic, it's not over, right? So how long is this pandemic going to last? We're never going to get back to normal, but how can we try to figure out where we're going to hit that breaking point again? It's going to be really hard.
That's an awesome example. I don't know, Matt, did you have anything you wanted to add into there?
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, we've been trying to think about this from the perspective of risk mitigation in general when we're doing our modeling, right? We try to build in controls relating to risk so that when we're thinking about agreements with publishers, neither us nor the publisher is at undue risk from these types of fluctuations. And to do that, a lot of it's about just what you said, Anne, is scenario planning and building models that are flexible enough to spit out results for what happens if we're exactly what we expect, what happens if we're, you know, X% higher than what we expect, if we're X% lower than what we expect on various parameters, right? What are the outcomes? Use that to figure out where do there need to be some risk mitigation controls in this agreement, so we can understand where to build kind of those guardrails to protect ourselves. And that's a really interesting challenge because it's very new in comparison with what we've previously done, at least in library contracts, right? Compared to like the subscription world where it's a little bit simpler. There's less in the way of moving parts, right? We have to plan for a lot of this potential fluctuation, and we don't know, we still don't know what the pandemic means for publication volume and submissions. I think some journals are seeing more submissions, some journals are seeing less. It all depends on what type of research it's publishing. So there's a lot of uncertainty around this that we're trying to plan around.
And I don't have much else to add, with the exception of just plugging that organizations have 6 months of operating cash on hand. And while that may fall outside the scope of our jobs, we can certainly fold that into our analyses and into the kinds of models that we're building. Like the worst case scenario is nothing. Here is why we need to work on building in cash on hand.
That's excellent. And it's funny too, Matt mentioned this, and I know Kristen's living this too, but submission fluctuation has been really huge, and it is impossible to predict. So all of a sudden, you know, in the PLOS journals, and I know they're not alone, are getting a whole lot more submissions. And our question is, well, will this stop if there's a prolonged period of time where people don't have access, you know, to the mechanisms they need to conduct research? Eventually, are we going to wind up with a trough equally as large as the surplus, you know, as the boon was? And it's really hard to do. So one thing that you also start to do, which we didn't mention, is start thinking about leading indicators. So maybe we can't analyze X the way we used to before, but what are the things that would impact X that we could start to look at to see if maybe, you know, are labs open? Are they not open? Is research funding declining? How has research funding been related to research in the past? Like all that kind of stuff. But anyway, I don't want us to overstay our welcome. So thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun even talking with you before today and figuring out what we were going to do. And it's been fun to work with all of you. So thank you.
Thank you.